Hello, my name is Jeremy Nathaniel Akers, and I'd like to talk to you about the Agreement Certainty Matrix, or, as we're going to remix it pretty heavily, the Cynefin Sensemaking Framework. First, though, how? How do we make use of these tools? Well, the important thing to know is what we're trying to get to is what type of challenge, situation, or context do we find ourselves in. We're trying to nail down some collective sense making to help us come to a better understanding about this context that we find ourselves in. For the sake of simplification, my recommendation is that we just mark ourselves down on a simple line graph, with predictable being on one extreme and unpredictable being on the other extreme. But again, how do we make use of this pattern of collective sense making to come to some form of shared understanding? Roughly speaking, the steps are thus. We brainstorm what challenge, situation, or context take up our time. Just make a list individually and give yourself about 5 minutes to do so. Once you've got that list, map those items to that matrix or that line graph that I just showed you. Give yourself about 5 minutes. First thought, best thought. Try not to overthink it too much. Once you've got it down on paper, then bring yourself into a relationship with somebody else and discuss and compare maps. Take about 5 minutes to do so. From this pair or dyad, move into a group of 4 or maybe 6 people and give yourself 10 minutes to discuss what type of agreements, differences, and mismatches you see compared to lists of items as well as placement of those items on that line graph or the matrix, the Agreement Certainty Matrix, or the Cynefin Sensemaking Framework. Whatever tool you're in, the point is, once you're in groups of 4, agreements, differences, mismatches. From those groups of 4, we move into an all-together thing, and we once more map all of our individual items to a shared matrix, keeping an eye out for what patterns emerge or we notice, and what mismatches exist that may need addressing in this all together. Can we get to a space where we can more agree than disagree? And once we've got that, after 10 minutes of discussion or so, if we have that, if we don't have that, regardless, we want to move into the action phase. So what is our reflection of this map, and what do we do with that information? Again, 10 minutes will be your magic happy space, and after 45 minutes altogether, you should have yourself a relatively robust shared understanding of what context we find ourselves in together. And there's a few different ways that we can map this information out. We're going to start with this one because I am a huge fan of simplification for the sake of accessibility for this very important information. So once we have once we've mapped our information onto a shared matrix, we want to understand that roughly speaking, there's 2 types of situations in the world. There are ordered situations that we can make use of sort of mechanical type thinking and think first about, and there are disordered situations that find themselves requiring a more relational type of thinking, and often that will require some form of action first. A classic example of mechanical type of thinking is literal clockwork. Thinking about an automobile, a vehicle, some form of engine. Take one part out, put in a new part, go faster, for example. A relational type of situation or challenge might be like your family. Try replacing your father. Here, kids, I have a better dad for you. This dad is functionally more superior in every way, shape, form, or fashion. Love him and find yourself accustomed to him. Automatically, this situation is revealed to be absurd because of the relational dynamics at play make one part not equivalent to another part. So once we've got the basic gist of ordered and disordered systems in place, we can continue to sort of refine our understanding. If we split these two halves into further halves, we come up with 4 general quadrants, situations, contexts. The first of which is a clear situation. And in the clear situation, we have known, tight, simple relationship with cause and effect. We understand how things relate and how things fit together, and so that leads us to a pattern of addressing challenges in this context that is based off this recipe of sense, categorization, and response. And my preferred example for clear challenges is doing the dishes. Our recipe for doing the dishes is pretty damn straightforward. You look at the dishes, you categorize them into a few different buckets. They're either dirty, in which case you clean them. They're either wet, in which case you dry them. Or they're clean, in which case you put them away. There's not a whole lot of freedom to operate, because once you have the category, the response is sort of almost predetermined by what is widely accepted as best practice. And the way that we would address this situation or keep an eye out for it, makes use of this pattern, and we would just keep an eye out for outliers in order to stay vigilant and once more apply this type of thinking or behavior in order to address any of these possible situations. In our ordered side, one more layer moving towards unpredictability, we would find ourselves in a complicated situation. The key trademark of complicated situations is that the situation itself is in fact knowable. Now, there may be some form of intricate, multiple, time-lagged causality, right? There might be a lot of moving parts, and that leads us to a pattern of resolution that is best categorized as sensing, analyzing, and responding. And a great example to help stick the landing on this one is assembling IKEA furniture. First thing you do is you open the box, you see what parts you've got there in front of you. The next thing you do is you find your instructions, you separate your parts, you do some analysis. But once you've found those instructions, you pretty much follow those instructions. Unless you find yourself in some form of chaotic good, in which case you freaking freestyle it. And, depending on your level of expertise, both of those might be relatively good practice. Compared to a simple or clear situation, we have ourselves more freedom of motion. We have a couple different alternatives we might jump into. And both of those alternatives are good practice depending on your context and your personal style and familiarity. And generally speaking, we would seek to ensure that we've got the right people, process, and time. Right people, right process at the right time, so that we can sense, analyze, and respond our way into solution states pretty much all day and every day. Moving over into our disordered categories, the first one towards the middle there is complex. Now, in complex situations, we find ourselves with unknown unknowns, where this loose relationship with cause and effect has to be discovered above and beyond all things, because we have to uncover these unknown unknowns. And so that leads us to a pattern, roughly speaking, of searching the problem and solution space that can be defined as probe, then sense, then respond. Again, broadly speaking, we want to think before we act. Here we want to get into a form of action. And we want to try stuff out. We want to adapt. And then we want to sense. we want to notice, observe, select, and then we want to go ahead and respond to what we sense with some form of reflection, retaining some qualities or actions, or orienting and deciding, feeding back into our next round of action. In this type of circumstance, ecosystems is the sort of archetypical context that you would imagine with complexity. Again, relationships are sort of the king, and so we're looking for, instead of this good practice, probably some form of emergent practice. As we probe the space, we discover, and that leads us to a retention in certain strategies and a deselection of others. And so practice sort of emerges, or solutions sort of emerge out of that continuous rotation. And what we're broadly trying to do is accelerate this pattern as much as we can. And we might actually want to run multiple probes in parallel as compared to the other categories. And our general recipe to address complex situations is by creating slack in the system or pattern of operation that gives us lots of space and time in order to reflect and look back and make adjustments. What's interesting to notice as we sort of stack up is that the solution space for each of these situations scales this way, but not this way. Just doesn't work. By creating slack for reflection, I could successfully address a complex situation or a complicated situation, and while it might waste some time for a simple or clear situation, creating slack for reflection would work. We would get through this challenge, probably not too long, but not quite as fast as we would if we just simply sensed, categorized, and responded. But if we try and sense, categorize, and respond ourselves into a complicated situation, we'll find that our buckets just sort of blow up. They explode, and we invite ourselves into some form of chaos. Now, chaos, when things are much more unpredictable than predictable, has this quality of unknowable, dynamic, unstable, or turbulent causality, right? There's just no way to know, and even what we do know is going to be outdated once we know it. And that leads us to a pattern of behavior that is really, really solidly grounded in intuition. As we act first, then we sense, and then we respond to that. And the example that I like to use is a situation known as war. On the battlefield, we have a high priority for engagement, active engagement, and then we sense the reactions that pop up based on our engagement, and then we react to those reactions, once more re-engaging. And what we're really looking for as we go around and around this loop is just continuous novel practice. And in this environment of chaos, we would seek to establish heuristics and parables, very shorthanded decision-making enablers, because we probably have way more choices than we have time to do this reflection thing. So giving ourselves some simplification, some heuristics, and some parables, some general stories that give us patterns of good behavior, it could just help us accelerate that route. And once more, this pattern of reacting, I find it works here in the chaos. We could use it successfully to address complex situations and complicated situations, even simple or clear situations. But if we tried to use complicated situations to address complexity, that just wouldn't translate, because there's these unknowns. And similarly, if we tried to use our playbook to address complexity by reflecting through this pattern of probe, sense, respond, again, we would find ourselves with more decisions than we have time to actually reflect upon and just continue, probably just die. Really, we probably wouldn't pass the evolutionary fitness test. So there's a sort of one-way street that makes the pattern for a more unpredictable situation acceptable, if not optimized. But don't try and use the recipe outside of its context. Otherwise, you blow up and invite yourself to die in chaos. So this line graph, broadly speaking, is a simplification of the Cynefin Sensemaking Framework, which I think is great. Shout out to my dudes Dave Snowden and the Cynefin at the Cynefin Center. This is an extraordinarily high value model, framework. I don't know, whatever he calls it. No matter what I say, Dave is going to find some issue. Rightly said, I'm not a perfect human being. But Cynefin is extraordinarily valuable. The challenge, though, is that I find it less accessible to a layperson. If you already know this information, then it's super awesome, high value, provides a lot of richness by sort of illustrating the relationships between categories or situations, and also introducing this intentional or unintentional state of confusion. It's just that if I'm trying to have a discussion and do the collective sense making here, I find that this requires a lot of understanding and explanation. And what I'm really trying to do is enable people to interface with the information without too much sort of theoretical underpinning. And I think that this line graph of just predictability and unpredictability simplifies in a way in which makes it relatively straightforward to intuit what the differences are, and in a way that we can accept and move on. Whereas here, I'm probably going to lose you. I mean, chances are I already lost you in this video, but that Cynefin is great. That's my point. And the information in that line graph is really based heavily or almost completely off of the information that comes from the Cynefin Sensemaking Framework. More classically, in the liberating structure scene, we tend to make use of the Stacy matrix, or what we call the agreement certainty matrix. So if we have close to agreement down here on the bottom, and far from agreement up here towards the top, and agreement on what you say, and that it would be our what, literally, our requirements, our business goals. What are we trying to accomplish? Do we agree on it? Yes. Is there a wide distribution or disagreement on it? No. Well, okay. The farther from agreement we have in this axis, the more tendency we are to find ourselves in a disordered system, or a complex or chaotic situation. And on the flip side, on the x-axis here, we find ourselves with certainty. If we're, again, close to certainty, if things are predictable about how those solutions or those requirements will unpack, or if we find ourselves far from certainty, we're not quite sure how we're going to accomplish our business goals. And if there's a lot of unpredictability, we find ourselves on the right. So if you want, you can start with this line graph of unpredictability to start with the x-axis. And if you really wanted to go nuts, you can introduce this y-axis of certainty to make it very, very explicit. Hey, look, we've got ourselves a wide distribution of dots. You think that this is clear, and that is less than clear. So hey, we probably find ourselves in a complex situation. I find this easier to explain to people that don't have a background, but nowhere near as easy to explain as this basic line graph of predictable here, unpredictable there. And as you can see, there's a high amount of overlap. right? We've got ourselves simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic, very much as we do with clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic in the Cynefin Sensemaking Framework. So regardless of which tool we're using to map and have this conversation, we end up having the same general conversation, and that some situations are simple, where we can just follow the recipe. It's essential. It's time tested and true, and you don't need any particular expertise to execute the recipe. And it's just follow the damn standardized procedure every time. Don't overthink it. Some situations are complicated, like sending a rocket to the moon, where we want to use rigid protocols and formulas where necessary, where sending one rocket increases the assurance of future success, and high levels of expertise in a variety of fields may be necessary for success, and all rockets find themselves similar to a high degree and have a lot of outcome predictability. And some situations are complex, like raising a child, where protocols don't really help, and you'll have to launch experiments continuously to really discover what works. And that even though you've raised one child, it doesn't exactly provide you with any amount of success or assurance of your future success. And expertise may help you out, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient to ensure success. And of course, every child is a unique individual with unpredictable outcomes. And some situations are just downright chaotic, pinning the tail on the donkey. You've got moving targets. Rigid protocols may be totally counterproductive and misdirect your responses. Experience may help or hinder in terms of finding what works to diagnose and abate the crisis in this situation. And rapid action and improvising skills, plus unleashing a network of local on-the-ground know-how can actually help. And as unknowableness recedes, novel patterns may emerge again. So generally, hopefully this hasn't been too much detail in running you through the Cynefin Sensemaking Framework or the Agreement Certainty Matrix. Again, my name's Jeremy Nathaniel Akers. The important portion of this is have a damn conversation about this question right here. What type of challenge, situation, or context do we find ourselves in? Because that context is king and has a very different playbook to help us address that challenge space and discover the most appropriate solution space. Thanks for your time, attention, and energy.